The engagement had concluded at 1:15 a.m., marked by the sonic signature of the final Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer's hull implosion. The U.S. Piranha, a Gato-class submarine, had expended its forward torpedo complement and was now executing the standard post-attack deep-dive evasion maneuver. The crew demonstrated efficiency, adhering precisely to the required silence and ballast adjustments. At 3 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Alex Keller, known universally within the Pacific Fleet as Doc due to his exacting, clinical command style, ordered a slow ascent to periscope depth. Protocol dictated a rapid withdrawal from the operational area. However, the damage sustained by the Japanese convoy was significant, and a visual assessment was deemed necessary for the patrol report. The scene observed through the periscope was not the anticipated tranquil, vacant expanse of night sea. The ocean's surface was a floating graveyard, illuminated intermittently by the remnants of burning oil slicks. Keller counted 7 distinct patches of heavy debris, confirming the destruction of at least 3 large vessels. The tactical success was undeniable, yet the sight was one of raw, wasteful carnage. The routine assessment was interrupted at 3:40 a.m., a little before the first suggestion of dawn. The Piranha's chief of the boat, Master Chief Petty Officer Dale Hansen, observed movement near a cluster of shattered buoyancy barrels. Captain, motion bearing 270, approximate distance 200 yards. Human forms. Keller rotated the periscope. The water was densely populated with men, clinging to flotsam. The numbers were large, perhaps 40 to 50 individuals, distributed in panicked clusters. The immediate tactical order was absolute. Submarines do not stop for survivors. Retrieval violates the core mission of stealth, compromises internal air quality, and risks the vessel's integrity due to overloading. However, the survivors were a mixed composition. Hansen, viewing the scene through the secondary optics, identified various uniforms, fragments of U.S. Navy fatigues, British merchant marine jackets, and, prominently, the dark uniforms of Imperial Japanese sailors. The engagement had been a brutal, fast exchange, creating a single, mixed debris field of both Allied and enemy combatants. At 4:05 a.m., a specific visual observation was logged. One Japanese survivor, clinging to a broken life raft, appeared to be wearing the insignia of a high-ranking naval officer. His condition was critical. He was bleeding heavily from a head wound, but was clearly attempting to organize the Japanese men surrounding him. The presence of a high-value enemy asset introduced a strategic element. Keller considered the potential intelligence gain versus the immense tactical risk. If the officer were captured, the rewards could justify the temporary exposure. He calculated the rising sun visibility and the known trajectory of returning enemy patrols. He had less than 20 minutes. At 4:15 a.m., Keller made the first of several critical deviations from standard procedure. He did not order the rescue of the Allied sailors. He ordered the Piranha to surface quickly and retrieve only the solitary Japanese officer and one Allied sailor for plausible deniability. "We are extracting the officer for interrogation," he stated flatly, ensuring the required official log entry supported the decision. The extraction was performed hastily by a 4-man deck crew under the looming threat of the dawn. Both the Allied sailor and the Japanese officer were hauled through the forward hatch, their saturated weight causing the ballast to shift immediately. As the hatch slammed shut, one of the deck crew, Seaman First Class Davies, reported a disturbing detail. "Captain, there are dozens of Allied men out there. They were calling out to us." Keller ignored the report and ordered the dive. But as the Piranha began its rapid descent, the tactical reasoning fractured. The image of the Allied sailors left floating. Men who had just been saved by the Piranha's torpedoes only to be abandoned by its crew was a raw, ethical breach. The single act of taking the Japanese officer had only highlighted the brutal decision to leave the rest. Below deck, the Japanese officer was secured in the torpedo room, breathing faintly. His rank confirmed he was a captain, a potential repository of massive intelligence. But Captain Keller knew the single retrieval was a lie to himself. He had violated procedure. The single capture had only amplified the moral failure. He paused at the control room door, his gaze fixed on the depth gauge. The Piranha was now dangerously unbalanced, its trim compromised by the extra weight. He knew that the single rescue had already initiated an irreversible chain of events. He had taken one. The logical necessity now demanded he choose between the safety of his vessel and the lives of those he had abandoned. The immediate issue following the retrieval of the initial 2 men was not intelligence, but hydrostatic stability. The saturated uniforms and the additional mass severely compromised the submarine's trim. The diving officer reported difficulty in maintaining a steady depth, noting that the vessel was dangerously heavy in the bow. The captain was presented with a choice: immediately vent ballast and run silent and deep, securing the vessel, or surface again to retrieve the remaining personnel, deliberately sacrificing tactical safety for humanitarian intervention. Lieutenant Commander Keller's internal tactical log, later recovered, indicates that at this point, the mission objective shifted entirely from enemy engagement to a matter of sustained survival. The risk of leaving Allied personnel, men wounded in the same battle, was judged to carry a greater psychological and moral cost to the crew than the immediate threat of detection. At 4:45 a.m., 30 minutes before the full visibility of the Pacific dawn, Keller ordered the second ascent. He instructed the communications officer to make no record of this maneuver in the official radio log. The retrieval of the remaining 41 men, a mix of U.S. Navy and Merchant Marine sailors and 30 Japanese Imperial Navy personnel, was chaotic and uncontrolled. The submarine was forced to remain surfaced for 15 minutes, an unprecedented exposure period in an active combat zone. The deck crew, led by Master Chief Hansen, worked not as a military unit, but as an emergency retrieval team, hauling men of both nationalities through the hatches and into the already crowded pressure hull. The logistical impact was immediate and catastrophic. The Piranha was designed to sustain a crew of 65 for extended patrol periods. It now contained 106 men, many of them wounded, saturated, and disoriented. The human cargo was distributed across every available compartment. The forward torpedo room, already housing the captive Japanese captain, was converted into a primary triage area, with men stacked shoulder to shoulder on the deck plates and nestled between the torpedo casings. The after-torpedo room housed the least injured of the Allied survivors. Passageways in the engine room and control room were rendered nearly impassable by bodies. Dr. Reynolds, the Piranha's sole medical officer, and his corpsmen immediately faced a crisis of scale. The submarine carried sufficient medical supplies for 4 severe injuries over a 2-month patrol. It now required treatment for dozens of complex wounds ranging from shrapnel trauma to severe burns, all requiring immediate stabilization. Reynolds established a systematic triage based strictly on urgency, overriding any nationalistic bias, a decision later noted in the supplementary medical report as the unofficial armistice. The environment inside the Piranha degraded instantly. The water and oil brought in by the survivors settled immediately in the bilge, increasing the internal humidity to near saturation. More critically, the introduction of over 40 additional breathing occupants drastically accelerated the consumption of breathable oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide. At 5:30 a.m., as the submarine completed its final dive into the comparative safety of deep water, the air monitoring system registered a critical spike. The control room annunciator panel illuminated the amber warning for atmospheric toxicity. The air purification system, built for a crew of 65, was immediately overwhelmed by the new metabolic strain. The caustic soda CO2 scrubbers, already nearing their operational limit, began to fail. Lieutenant Commander Keller received the report from the engineering officer. "Captain, CO2 concentration is rising rapidly. We will exhaust the current chemical scrub capacity in less than 72 hours. Ventilation is mandatory, but surfacing is impossible." The humanitarian decision had transformed the Piranha from an attack vessel into a sealed, sinking atmospheric trap. The initial crisis of the external threat was replaced by the imminent, internal threat of suffocation. The clock on the vessel's survival, and that of the 43 additional souls aboard, had officially begun its countdown. With the vessel submerged and the immediate external threat temporarily mitigated, the internal crisis shifted from atmospheric toxicity to resource management and compartmentalized security. Lieutenant Commander Keller assigned armed security details to the main hatches, a measure necessitated not by enemy engagement, but by the presence of 43 foreign nationals, 30 of whom were active combatants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The submarine was now simultaneously a prison, a refuge, and a hospital. The largest concentration of wounded was established in the forward torpedo room. Dr. Reynolds, operating under the extreme duress of limited light and continuous internal humidity, established a clinical order. He implemented the unofficial armistice by sheer necessity. Allied and Japanese wounded were intermixed based solely on the severity of their injuries, not their nationality. The Japanese captain, whose status as a high-value asset afforded him the least crowded space, was designated Patient Zero for intelligence purposes, but received no preferential medical treatment. The crew of the Piranha was forced into roles entirely outside their training. Engine room personnel became orderlies, utilizing the little fresh water remaining for cleaning and sanitation. Cooks became nurses, administering the meager rations. The psychological toll of serving hot broth to men who, hours earlier, were the intended targets of the vessel's torpedoes was significant, as noted in the later reports from the ship's psychologist. The common denominator became the preservation of life itself. This fragile, operational truce was tested severely shortly after the morning meal. At 10:15 a.m., a Japanese enlisted man, identified as Seaman Third Class Katori, a survivor with a severe leg fracture, managed to crawl undetected from the torpedo room into the aft compartments. His movement was driven not by pain, but by doctrine. He reached the engineering spaces, where he attempted to access the high-pressure compressed air banks used for emergency ballast ejection and torpedo firing. His objective was clear: render the Piranha incapable of emergency surfacing or combat. Katori was discovered not by a Piranha crewman, but by a British merchant marine sailor, Mr. Henry Davies, who was himself suffering from steam burns and had been assigned to monitor water pressure gauges. Davies, recognizing the critical nature of Katori's actions near the vital infrastructure, engaged the man despite his injuries, initiating a low-grade physical struggle that was quickly contained by the engineering officer. The event demonstrated the breakdown of the humanitarian exchange when confronted with fundamental military imperative. The engineering officer placed Katori under physical restraint. The resolution, however, did not come from the American command. Moments later, the Japanese captain, witnessing the commotion from his position forward, transmitted a guttural command in Japanese. Despite his obvious pain, his tone carried an absolute authority. The remaining Japanese survivors, who had begun to stir in response to the noise, immediately settled. The captain confirmed to Dr. Reynolds, through broken English, that Katori's action was unauthorized and against the interests of the shared survival compact. This intervention solidified the unofficial armistice. It was now a mutual, enforced contract for survival, predicated on the captain's status and the immediate threat of the atmosphere. The security detail was doubled, and the remaining Japanese survivors were instructed to police their own ranks. The internal unity was achieved, not through trust, but through a calculated, shared need for the Piranha's technical support. The relative quiet returned, broken only by the continuous whir of the exhausted ventilation fans. But the momentary stability was immediately challenged from the exterior. At 11:05 a.m., the sonar operator reported acoustic contact, multiple high-speed screws. Bearing 275. Classification: Imperial Navy Destroyer Patrol, actively pinging. The noise from the enemy patrol was clearly audible in the overcrowded hull. The Piranha, heavy and compromised, was now trapped. The acoustic contact reported at 11:05 a.m. was quickly classified as a patrol of two Yugimo-class Japanese destroyers, actively employing high-frequency sonar in a systematic search pattern. Lieutenant Commander Keller immediately issued the highest-level command for silent running, requiring all non-essential machinery to be secured and all personnel to remain motionless. This order, routine under normal circumstances, became an exercise in operational impossibility. The Piranha was already listing heavily, and the density of human bodies in the compartments meant that any slight movement, a shift in weight, a sudden cough from a medic, or a moan from a severely injured man, was amplified within the steel pressure hull. The sonar operator reported that the vessel's own internal acoustic signature was elevated, not due to machinery, but due to the 43 additional human factors. The Piranha was, acoustically, a ghost ship carrying too many souls. The critical issue was maintaining depth. The excess weight rendered the submarine sluggish to maneuver. The diving officer struggled to hold the vessel at the safety depth of 300 feet. Every minor compensation in the ballast tanks, a necessity to combat the trim issue, resulted in a burst of noise that risked revealing their position to the destroyers above. At 11:45 a.m., the sound of the lead destroyer's twin screws became a high-frequency roar directly overhead. The crew and the survivors held their breath, an action noted later by the chief of the boat as an unplanned, collective survival response. The sound of the active sonar ping striking the hull was a physical shock, reverberating through the structure. The vessel was compromised, but undetected. The second destroyer, however, adopted a different tactic. At 11:55 a.m., following the passage of the first vessel, the acoustic signature of the trailing destroyer slowed, indicating a deliberate stop and the preparation for ordnance deployment. Keller ordered a slight, silent change in rudder to evade, a maneuver rendered slow and ineffective by the overload. The first depth charge detonated at 12:01 p.m., its shockwave striking the hull not with a singular impact, but as a violent, crushing compression of the surrounding water. The blast was not a direct hit, but a near misses, close enough to cause significant systemic damage. In the control room, lights flickered. In the cramped forward torpedo room, where the most critically wounded were lying, the structural impact was immediately evident. The engineering officer reported a small, but persistent, ingress of seawater near the auxiliary pump housing in the adjacent crew's mess. More concerning was the damage observed by Dr. Reynolds in the makeshift triage area. The violent shock had caused two main deck plates to buckle slightly. Crucially, the force had exacerbated the head wound of the Japanese captain, whose bandages immediately began to saturate with fresh blood. Simultaneously, the force jarred loose the seal on an inspection port in the forward lower hull. At 12:15 p.m., the damage report confirmed the structural breach, a hairline fracture near the main ventilation duct, resulting in a low volume but continuous seepage of external seawater. The water intrusion was manageable for the moment, but the psychological impact on the wounded, now fully aware of their extreme, exposed state, was profound. The Piranha was now taking on water, however slowly, increasing the trim difficulty and further compromising the vessel's ability to remain submerged. The threat was no longer merely evasion. It was about internal integrity. Keller's clinical determination hardened. The compromised vessel was now operating under the combined tyranny of external pressure, internal chaos, and the ticking clock of the oxygen supply. The destroyers above were still hunting, forcing the captain to manage a growing crisis while immobile and silent. The structural integrity breach, the small hull fracture sustained during the depth charge attack, was ultimately less critical than the atmospheric decline. The seawater intrusion was manageable by the engineering department's continuous, quiet pumping. The carbon dioxide concentration, however, was not. At 2 p.m., the air monitoring system displayed a CO2 concentration of 3.5%, a level already inducing measurable cognitive impairment in the crew and severe respiratory distress in the wounded. The engineering officer confirmed that the current trajectory indicated a toxic environment, above 5% CO2, within 18 hours. This fixed, absolute deadline superseded all other tactical concerns. The submarine could not surface due to the continued presence of enemy patrols detected hours earlier, meaning survival depended entirely on conservation. Lieutenant Commander Keller and Dr. Reynolds convened in the control room. The discussion was clinical and without sentiment, focusing on logistics and human necessity. The remaining oxygen supply was finite, stored in high-pressure bottles intended for emergency engine starting and specific medical treatments. To slow the inevitable poisoning, 3 immediate protocols were established. Reduction of exertion. All non-essential physical activity by the crew was ceased. Personnel were restricted to absolute minimum movement, operating under a deliberate, slowed pace to reduce metabolic demand. Rationing of illumination. All internal lighting, except for essential instruments and the triage area, was extinguished, plunging the majority of the vessel into perpetual, heavy shadow. This conservation measure was also intended to reduce the psychological strain of forced proximity. Oxygen triage. This was the most morally complex order. Dr. Reynolds was authorized to administer the remaining oxygen supply only to those personnel, regardless of nationality, whose immediate survival depended on it, and whose chances of long-term recovery were demonstrably high. At 3:30 p.m., Dr. Reynolds faced the grim reality of the order in the suffocating heat of the forward torpedo room. The air was heavy, metallic, and still. The Japanese captain, whose status as a strategic asset granted him high priority, was failing rapidly due to the exacerbated head trauma and the poor air quality. Reynolds immediately diverted one of the few remaining medical oxygen tanks to his mask, stabilizing his breathing. However, the decision immediately demanded sacrifices. Two Allied sailors, one with severe third-degree burns across his back, the other with internal shrapnel damage, were actively struggling for breath, but were judged by Reynolds to have prognosis too poor to justify the expenditure of the finite air. The available oxygen, the doctor noted in his report, was worth more to the vessel's overall survival being administered to others. The act was not malevolence, but mathematical certainty, an ethical choice dictated by mechanical constraints. Reynolds ordered the two men to be moved to the slightly cooler, but unventilated, compartment near the escape trunk, where they would be given palliative care only. The silence surrounding this clinical execution of duty was absolute. No crewman protested. The shared awareness of the situation rendered judgment obsolete. The psychological atmosphere within the Piranha hardened. The crew understood that the distinction between Allied and enemy was irrelevant under the tyranny of the internal air clock. The vessel was no longer sailing towards a destination. It was merely attempting to decelerate its own decay. At 5 p.m., the air pressure gauges stabilized momentarily. The severe rationing had bought them an extension, pushing the estimated CO2 limit back by approximately 6 hours. But the price of this extension was the absolute silence and physical stillness of over 100 men trapped in a vessel designed for 65. The pressure built slowly, silently, forcing Keller to consider the ultimate breach of the unofficial armistice, the extraction of information from the stabilized Japanese captain. The need for intelligence to shorten their transit time and find a safe, isolated area to surface now outweighed the medical necessity of his rest. The tactical had returned to supersede the humanitarian. By 8:15 p.m., the CO2 level inside the Piranha had climbed past 4%, and the atmosphere was thick with humidity and the smell of oil and antiseptic. The lack of sleep, combined with the mild asphyxiation, created a tense, volatile silence throughout the vessel. With the oxygen clock running, Lieutenant Commander Keller initiated the interrogation of the Japanese captain, whose vital signs were marginally stable under the continuous flow of medical oxygen. The interview was conducted in the confines of the torpedo room, with Dr. Reynolds present to monitor the captain's distress, and Master Chief Hansen serving as the armed, silent witness. Keller employed no brutal methods, relying instead on the shared certainty of their predicament. The Japanese captain, a man whose dignity remained intact despite his near-fatal injuries and humiliation, grasped the mutual threat posed by the atmosphere. "You are a commander. I am a commander," Keller began, his voice a low, steady rumble that barely penetrated the sound of the ventilator. "Your life, and the lives of your men and mine, are currently measured in hours. I need safe water to surface and ventilate. Where were you heading? What was your target?" The captain, who identified himself as Captain Jiro Sato, resisted initially, communicating through clipped, heavily accented English. He offered only standard patrol objectives, which Keller immediately dismissed as useless. Sato's severe head wound rendered prolonged resistance physically impossible. Dr. Reynolds advised Keller that the captain had perhaps 30 minutes of conscious coherence remaining. Under this strict time limit, Keller adjusted his approach, appealing to the shared responsibility for the wounded men of both nations now lying in the cramped quarters. This shared circumstance proved more persuasive than any threat of force. At 8:45 p.m., Captain Sato relented, speaking with immense effort. He revealed that he was not escorting standard cargo. His destroyer was a covert transport carrying a high-security cryptographic device and, crucially, the detailed charts for a secret Imperial Navy refueling depot. This depot, codenamed Sealed Lagoon, was situated on an uncharted atoll, 300 miles east of their current position, well outside the known enemy patrol routes and, more importantly, possessing a lagoon shallow enough to make destroyer patrol impossible, yet deep enough for a submarine to sit safely on the bottom. The location, Sato whispered, is known only to 3 officers. If I do not survive, the charts are destroyed. The prize was immense, not just a safe haven, but the only nearby location where Keller could risk surfacing the compromised vessel without immediately encountering enemy surface vessels. Sato provided a set of coordinates, which Keller immediately logged and cross-referenced with the Piranha's internal navigations. However, the intelligence came with a critical, ethical counterpoint. Sato then revealed the true cargo he had been protecting. The contents of the sealed crates were not weapons or ammunition, but 36 priceless artifacts, ancient religious sculptures, and scroll fragments stolen from Allied-held territories, intended for a secret museum in Tokyo. Sato believed their safe passage was vital to Japan's cultural future. "They are useless to you," Sato articulated, his breath hissing through the mask. "But they are the reason for my journey. They are fragile. They must not be damaged." Sato's voice trailed off, his breathing shallowing and becoming erratic. Dr. Reynolds quickly adjusted the oxygen flow, but the captain's eyes became unfocused. He had delivered his secret, but the effort had cost him his remaining stability. Keller now had the coordinates, a tactical solution to the atmospheric crisis. But the journey meant pushing the severely listing, overloaded submarine to its structural limits, while simultaneously protecting a cargo of stolen cultural history, placing the lives of his crew and the men he rescued in service of a Japanese cultural heist. At 9 p.m., Keller gave the order to the navigation officer. "Set course for the coordinates. Full silent running. Maximum transit speed permitted by the CO2 limit." The Piranha began its desperate, slow transit toward the sealed lagoon. The 90-mile transit to the coordinates provided by Captain Sato was executed under conditions of extreme operational stress. Lieutenant Commander Keller enforced full silent running doctrine, pushing the electric motors to their maximum efficient speed while simultaneously maintaining acoustic integrity. The speed of the transit was governed entirely by the atmospheric decay, making the journey a direct race against the rising CO2 levels. By 1 a.m., 4 hours into the transit, the internal atmosphere had become overtly toxic. The CO2 concentration surpassed 4.5%. This induced widespread symptoms among the personnel: chronic, debilitating headaches, pronounced difficulty focusing, and periods of shallow, rapid breathing among the least acclimated crew members. Dr. Reynolds administered the remaining ampoules of stimulant medication to key personnel: Keller, the diving officer, and the navigator, to temporarily combat the cognitive degradation. The crew was now operating in a state of medically induced, low-oxygen intoxication. The physical state of the vessel remained critical. The trim difficulty persisted, worsened by the constant movement required by the navigator to correct their course. Any adjustment, however minor, caused the Piranha to list awkwardly, increasing the fear among the survivors that the vessel was uncontrollably sinking. The navigation officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Evans, struggled most severely under the combined physical and psychological duress. The coordinates supplied by Sato led them into an uncharted area of submerged volcanic activity. Evans was forced to rely on fragmented depth readings and the submarine's inferior charts, navigating a minefield of potential underwater reefs and unexpected pressure currents, all while fighting off the symptoms of CO2 poisoning. At 2:45 a.m., Keller personally monitored the depth gauge alongside Evans. The sonar reports indicated that the seabed ahead was rising rapidly, suggesting the proximity of the atoll. The critical moment of the transit was the approach to the sealed lagoon, which Sato had described as being ringed by dangerously shallow reefs. The only safe entry point was a narrow channel, which the Piranha had to locate and penetrate while remaining submerged and silent. The navigator, shaking violently, finally whispered the visual confirmation through the periscope: "Land on the starboard beam. Heavily vegetated." Uncharted. At 3:30 a.m., the Piranha slowed to near-zero velocity. The challenge was no longer evasion, but geometry. The vessel had to pass through a channel approximately 50 feet wider than its beam, without producing the noise of surfacing and ventilation. Keller ordered the extreme measure of sinking the vessel to rest on the seabed, utilizing the sand and silt to cushion the hull and suppress internal noise, a violation of both deep-water and shallow-water doctrine. The maneuver took 20 minutes. At 3:50 a.m., the Piranha settled with a soft, grinding shudder into the silt of the sealed lagoon floor 35 feet below the surface. The pressure hull, already stressed by the depth charge, emitted a low, continuous groan. The CO2 meter now read a staggering 4.9%. The captain immediately issued the order: blow ballast tanks. Prepare for ventilation. The moment they surfaced, they would expose themselves to any lingering threat, but the atmospheric clock had run down. They had bought mere minutes of safety by hiding in the lagoon. The next phase, the full surfacing and ventilation, would either save them all or expose them to final destruction. The order to blow ballast was the final, desperate act of the sealed transit. At 4 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Keller initiated the procedure. The sudden, violent rush of compressed air displacing the water in the ballast tanks created a deafening roar within the pressure hull, a sound deliberately sacrificed for the necessity of breath. The vessel, overloaded and heavy, ascended sluggishly, breaking the surface of the quiet lagoon at 4:15 a.m. with a heavy splash. The immediate objective was ventilation. The main induction vents were opened simultaneously with the control room hatch. The sensation of the first pure, ambient air rushing into the stagnant atmosphere was overwhelming. Crew and survivors alike reacted viscerally, collapsing onto the deck or gripping nearby railings as the CO2-induced vertigo subsided. Within 15 minutes, the air monitors registered a safe, stable atmosphere, but the physical and cognitive aftereffects of the prolonged poisoning would linger for days. The sealed lagoon proved to be exactly as Captain Sato had described: a small, volcanic cove, hidden by dense, tropical foliage and protected by a narrow, submerged coral entrance. It was a tactical dead end, invisible from the sea lanes, and effectively rendered enemy destroyer patrols impossible due to its shallow depth. For the first time in 48 hours, the Piranha was externally safe. Dr. Reynolds immediately assessed the casualties now that the extreme oxygen deficit was resolved. The two Allied sailors previously designated for palliative care were stabilized but required immediate evacuation. The most critical, however, was Captain Jiro Sato. Despite the continuous medical oxygen administered during the transit, the combined effect of his severe head wound, the depth charge shock, and the systemic CO2 poisoning proved fatal. At 5:05 a.m., Captain Sato was officially declared deceased. His death was logged as a direct complication of combat trauma, but the ancillary cause was undeniably the atmospheric toxicity of the submarine. With his passing, the primary intelligence objective of the mission was fulfilled and simultaneously terminated. The secret of the lagoon and the artifacts died with the last of the 3 men who knew the location. With the immediate survival crisis over, Keller was forced to address the second component of Sato's secret: the cargo. The Japanese captain's crates, previously ignored, were now brought under the glaring inspection lights. They were heavy, reinforced wooden containers sealed with Japanese naval wax stamps. Upon opening the largest crate, the deck crew found not weapons or cryptography, but cultural history. Inside, cushioned by meticulous silk padding, was a fragile, millennia-old bronze statue, a Hindu deity of immense craftsmanship. The second crate contained rolled, brittle scroll fragments and ancient religious iconography. The realization settled quickly among the crew. They had risked their lives, violated naval doctrine, abandoned their own allies in the water, endured a depth charge attack, and poisoned themselves with their own breath, all in part to ensure the safe passage of stolen museum artifacts. Keller ordered the artifacts to be temporarily secured in the now empty captain's cabin, logged under the designation Operation Spoils. He then gave the second critical order: we have water intrusion and hull stress. We have 41 survivors, 3 of them enemy combatants, and we have 65 exhausted crew. We are now a triage center. The priority is to repair the hull, ration our fresh water, and prepare for the long voyage home. We are officially a hospital ship. The Piranha, exposed to the bright tropical sun in the safety of the lagoon, was no longer a stealth vessel. It was an exposed, damaged rescue barge, loaded with the wounded, the dead, and the spoils of a brutal cultural war, waiting for a long, arduous journey. The conversion of the Piranha from an attack vessel to a viable hospital ship began immediately upon ventilation. Lieutenant Commander Keller assigned the crew to three critical, simultaneous details: engineering, hull repair, medical, sanitation and casualty stabilization, and security, logistics, and resource control. The immediate priority for the engineering department was the hairline fracture near the main ventilation duct, which was slowly taking on water. Working with minimal tools and in the intense tropical heat of the exposed hull, the crew utilized a combination of temporary welding and a specialized marine epoxy intended for non-pressure repairs. The work was slow, but by 10 a.m., the fracture was sealed, halting the continuous ingress of seawater. Seawater was employed for basic sanitation, a measure that exacerbated the humidity but was necessary to prevent systemic infection outbreaks. The most significant internal conflict arose over the cargo secured in the captain's cabin, the bronze artifacts and scroll fragments designated operation spoils. At 1:30 p.m., Master Chief Hansen, highly respected by the crew, approached Keller regarding the ethical and tactical liability of the cargo. "Captain," Hansen stated, "we risked half the crew's lives and almost lost the ship for a cargo that belongs to the enemy. We are barely able to sustain 40 wounded men, but we are prioritizing the preservation of a stolen idol. The men are questioning the sanity of it." Keller's response was sharp and pragmatic, recorded in the supplementary command notes. "We transported Captain Sato for intelligence. He gave us the coordinates to this safe haven in exchange for the safety of his cargo. The safe haven saved us from being drowned by CO2. The exchange stands. These artifacts are a diplomatic issue now, not a tactical one. They will not be jettisoned. They are the cost of our safe passage and a liability we must manage." The artifacts were secured under constant guard. Keller effectively ruled that the successful extraction of life outweighed the moral objection to the spoils of war. Dr. Reynolds, utilizing the fresh air and limited resources, stabilized the remaining critical patients. The three surviving Japanese enlisted men were the highest risk factor. They were separated from the rest of the survivors, now housed in the less cramped but extremely hot engine room, and placed under continuous, armed watch in the after-torpedo room. Their condition was stable, but their presence was a persistent source of tension. At 5 p.m., Keller convened the department heads. Based on the vessel's hull stress, limited fuel, and the need to conserve the remaining CO2 scrubbers for potential emergency submergence, the return journey was estimated to require a minimum of 10 days of slow, silent running. Travel protocol: the Piranha would surface only between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. for rapid ventilation and battery charging. It would remain submerged and silent during all daylight hours. Communications: all radio communication remains strictly forbidden to preserve stealth. Hospital status: all personnel, allied and enemy, were under the strict jurisdiction of Dr. Reynolds and the hospital ship protocol. Any disruption of the medical order would be treated as mutiny. The Piranha, now a slow, fragile refuge carrying a heavy load of human and cultural cargo, prepared to depart the safe, silent waters of the sealed lagoon. The long voyage home, under the perpetual threat of internal decay and external pursuit, was about to begin. The departure from this sealed lagoon at 10 p.m., day 1, marked the beginning of the true endurance test. The journey required 10 days of meticulously managed cycles of silence and rapid surface maneuvers, pushing the crew to the limits of physical and psychological capacity. The operational day was divided into 2 phases, dictated by the travel protocol: submerged silence, 19 hours from 5 a.m. to 2 a.m. The vessel was in absolute silence, running on battery power at minimal speed. This phase demanded total immobility from the 106 souls packed inside the hull. The air, though safe due to the previous night's ventilation, rapidly degraded in quality, increasing humidity and leading to pervasive fatigue and irritability. Surface chaos: 3 hours the window between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. was a flurry of chaotic activity. The Piranha would surface, the diesel engines would roar to life, charging the batteries, and the main induction vents would gulp the fresh night air. This was the only time sanitation, minor repairs, and communication between departments could occur. The exhaustion of the crew meant this vital period was ripe for errors. The forced cohabitation between the 41 survivors, Allied merchant crew, British naval personnel, and the 3 Japanese enlisted men, and the submarine crew became the primary source of internal friction. Dr. Reynolds's hospital status decree imposed a fragile order, but the underlying hatreds remained. On day 3, during the submerged silent period, a severe incident occurred in the engine room, where the majority of Allied survivors were housed. A British merchant sailor, Mr. Davies, the same sailor who had thwarted the sabotage attempt, discovered one of the Japanese survivors, Seaman First Class Ishii, attempting to discard a contaminated surgical bandage by concealing it in the engine room's cooling coil housing. Davies, already running on exhaustion and low oxygen, interpreted the action as deliberate sanitary sabotage. He broke the rule of silence by striking Ishii. The ensuing, muffled struggle was immediately contained by the engineering officer, but the noise threatened to compromise the vessel's acoustic signature. Keller, informed of the incident, delivered a ruling that was purely disciplinary and tactical. He ordered the British sailor confined to the tiny, unventilated torpedo storage locker for 12 hours. Ishii received no punishment. Keller's reasoning, recorded later, was clinical. The truce must be enforced not by alliance, but by the immediate, visible cost of disruption. The Allied sailor, due to his lower value as a combat asset, presented the cheaper lesson. The incident solidified the understanding that the ship's order was ruthlessly pragmatic and entirely dictated by Keller's command authority, superseding any pre-existing moral code of war. Dr. Reynolds faced an entirely new medical crisis. The constant humidity and extreme temperatures, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the engine and torpedo rooms, fostered rampant skin and soft tissue infections, particularly in the shrapnel wounds of the non-Japanese survivors. On the afternoon of day 3, a British naval officer developed a rapid and alarming fever, symptomatic of severe sepsis. Reynolds determined the infection was beyond the scope of the remaining on-board antibiotics. He was forced to perform an emergency, unauthorized procedure, draining the abscess in the engine room's limited light, relying on heavily diluted ethanol as the only available sterilizing agent for his tools. The procedure succeeded, but it served as a brutal reminder that the Piranha was slowly losing its medical war. As the Piranha entered day 4 of its long, silent run, the distance covered was minimal. Every mile gained came at a price of psychological endurance, and the crew understood that 10 days was an optimistic estimate. The true enemy was no longer the sea or the surface patrols, but the cumulative rot, both physical and moral, within the hull. By day 6 of the transit, the Piranha was a vessel operating entirely on a crude debt. Water rations were cut again. The humidity was near saturation point, accelerating the decay of the remaining food stores and intensifying the crew's skin infections. The estimated time to friendly waters remained 4 full days, a psychological eternity. The breaking point occurred during the midday submerged silent period. The resentment over the operation spoils artifacts, secured in the captain's cabin, had festered among the non-naval Allied survivors. The British naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Sterling, whose fever had recently subsided but whose mental state was volatile, saw the preservation of the bronze idol as an intolerable moral betrayal of the men who had died under Japanese guns. At 1:45 p.m., Sterling, moving with desperate, silent precision despite his weakness, used a heavy piece of shrapnel, which he had retained from his own wound, to cut the restraints securing the heavy crates. His intention was to drag the artifacts to the control room, hatch, and jettison them during the next surface period. The sudden shift in weight, however, caused one of the largest crates to slide, impacting a crucial junction box for the emergency bilge pump circuitry. The resulting brief, loud electrical short compromised the integrity of the power panel. The primary damage was logistical. The emergency pump, a secondary defense against any catastrophic hull failure, was now inoperative. The immediate, Localized chaos violated the absolute requirement for silence. Lieutenant Commander Keller, who had been studying navigation charts, arrived at the captain's cabin instantly. He assessed the damage and the perpetrator. Sterling, pale and breathing rapidly, stood over the spilled contents of the crate, which included the bronze statue, now partially visible under its silk wrapping. Keller did not raise his voice. His response was chillingly detached, reflecting the extreme pressure and the strategic necessity of maintaining command. Sterling's act was mutiny, threatening the survival of all 106 men. "This vessel," Keller stated, his words a low, heavy weight in the oppressive silence, "is maintained by doctrine, not by moral sentiment. You have traded the tactical safety of every man on this vessel for an act of symbolic protest. The cost must be immediate." Keller did not resort to physical confinement, a measure that would further compromise sanitation and stress the remaining crew. Instead, he consulted with Dr. Reynolds, who confirmed Sterling's condition was medically stable but relied heavily on pain management. Keller's ruling was a calculated use of the crew was a study in controlled collapse. Their skin was pale and afflicted, their movements sluggish from exhaustion and dehydration, yet their discipline was absolute. The psychological truce held, cemented not by goodwill, but by the universal, desperate need for port. At 1 a.m. on day 10, during the final ventilation period, the sonar picked up an acoustic signature, a fast-moving, high-frequency vessel, an Allied PC-class patrol craft, not the anticipated rendezvous destroyer, but close enough to be a fatal threat if they were misidentified. Keller instantly ordered a rapid crash dive. The strained hull groaned violently under the quick pressure change. They leveled off at 150 feet, the vessel shaking, waiting for the patrol craft to pass overhead. During the deep descent, a sharp spike was detected in the internal CO2 reading, indicating a momentary, severe failure in the main ventilation valve seal, a direct consequence of the damaged hull flexing under pressure. For a heart-stopping 2 minutes, the air became acutely poisonous. The crisis passed as the hull stabilized, but the failure served as a final, brutal reminder that the Piranha was at the absolute limit of its structural integrity. At 4:30 a.m., Keller successfully established contact with the designated rendezvous vessel, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Fletcher. The rendezvous was executed under the pre-dawn darkness, a complex transfer involving a submerged submarine and a maneuvering destroyer. The handover was clinical and swift. Dr. Reynolds supervised the transfer of the 40 surviving wounded personnel, Allied and enemy. The 3 surviving Japanese enlisted men were immediately taken into custody by a detachment of Marines aboard the Fletcher. The crates containing the Japanese artifacts, designated operation spoils, were hoisted onto the destroyer. Keller provided the commanding officer with a single, sealed report detailing Captain Sato's intelligence exchange. The artifacts, deemed politically sensitive, were destined for storage under naval intelligence jurisdiction, their immediate fate unknown. The body of Captain Jiro Sato was formally transferred to the Fletcher for burial at sea with full military honors, a measure of respect ordered by Keller for the man whose defiance and intelligence had saved the Piranha. The U.S. Piranha limped into its home port at 11 a.m., day 10, completing its mission. The vessel was immediately dry-docked and declared non-operational pending extensive repairs, a process that would take 6 months. The formal Naval Board of Inquiry that followed found Lieutenant Commander Keller's command decisions justified by the principle of overriding necessity. He was absolved of any wrongdoing regarding the unofficial armistice, the unauthorized medical triage, and the preservation of the enemy artifacts, all of which were ruled essential measures taken to preserve American military assets and personnel in an extreme combat environment. The unofficial armistice. While establishing communication with the enemy was a breach of protocol, it resulted in the acquisition of critical intelligence, the coordinates, that saved the vessel and crew from atmospheric failure. Triage and casualty management. Dr. Reynolds's decisions regarding oxygen rationing and pain management were ruled medically sound under the unique constraints of the CO2 poisoning crisis. The spoils. The artifacts were ultimately repatriated after the war, their initial role in securing the Piranha's survival never publicly acknowledged. Personnel fate. Lieutenant Commander Sterling, The British officer who attempted to destroy the spoils was discharged from the hospital and received an official reprimand, but no further punitive action was taken, reflecting the ambiguous nature of the moral conflict. Lieutenant Commander Keller was immediately reassigned to command a new fleet submarine. His actions were deemed too unorthodox and the events too complex for public consumption. His official report simply stated that the vessel sustained damage and returned with survivors from a downed enemy destroyer. The true story of the Piranha, the unofficial armistice, the oxygen triage, the silent struggle against internal decay, and the long voyage home as a fragile hospital ship, was locked within the classified files of the Naval Archives, a testament to the brutal, pragmatic calculus of survival demanded by the deep-sea war.